Here's a question I hear a lot. Other countries have double-decker trains. Britain's trains are overcrowded. Why doesn't Britain just build double-decker trains? After all, they carry almost twice as many people while expending rather less than twice the power. Since I recently covered the question of why we don't have double-decker trams anymore, I figured why not look into it. Now there are three answers to this question. One is historic, one is scientific, and one is we did and it didn't work. So firstly, the historic. It's down to the loading gauge. The loading gauge is how wide and how tall you can make your trains. It decides everything about your railway. How high the bridges and tunnels are, how far the station platforms are from the track, where you put the signals, how big your locomotives can be, how much land you need to acquire. You name it, the chances are that the loading gauge affects it. In Britain we have an unusually small loading gauge. I guess that's what happens when you get there first. Other countries, with a few exceptions, have larger loading gauges that allow things like, yes, double-decker trains. Now, some railways in Britain were built with a somewhat larger loading gauge. The Great Western Railway was originally built with broader tracks than the standard, and as a result it could take wider trains even after the tracks were converted to standard gauge. The Great Central Railway was also built with a larger loading gauge. Legend has it that this was because it was to be part of a truly incredible main line from Manchester to Paris, although this has never been confirmed. It's kind of academic, because the Great Central Main Line was closed by British Railways, under road-loving Transport Minister Ernest Marples. New mainline railways are also often built with a larger loading gauge, and that's because, since the Channel Tunnel opened, it's been possible to run trains to Europe and beyond. I mean, we don't always make the best use of that, but in theory we could. So that's the historical reason. We can't run double-decker trains without rebuilding our entire network. The scientific reason comes down to crowding. Now, if you've ever been on a really crowded train during rush hour, you'll know what a pain it is when you come to a station. Lots of people wanting to get on, lots of people wanting to get off, lots of people staying put so you have to push past, someone stands aside to let someone else go first, the other person insists on going after them, then an old lady shoves past all of them. You know how it goes. It takes forever. Now imagine that, but you also have to factor in a second deck. Not only do you have all that rigmarole I just mentioned, but you also have people coming down the stairs. You're going to have to factor in extra time at every station. The busiest train services in Britain all centre on cities, which is no surprise. The vast majority run to or through London. Most of them are commuter services. That means frequent stops and busy lines. The busiest trains are the Thameslink services through London. On the core section, these operate literally a couple of minutes apart. If you have to add an extra minute into the timetable at each stop, the result will be that you'll have to operate fewer trains. In fact, once you take this into account, the overall increase in capacity for each line is, well, estimates differ. Optimistic estimates suggest 15%. Pessimistic estimates, more like 10. I guess it depends how many people you can squeeze in there and how quick they are on their feet. Now, for all I've been saying that you can't build a double-decker train in the UK, someone actually did. OVS Bulleid, Chief Mechanical Engineer of the Southern Railway, gave Britain its only double-decker train back in the 40s. Bulleid was the kind of man who took the word can't as a personal insult. He was always up for a bit of a challenge, and he wasn't afraid of a bit of experimentation. Sometimes this worked, like with his funny-looking but very powerful Q1 freight locomotive. And sometimes it didn't, like with his experimental ultra-modern steam locomotive Leader. His double-decker train fell more into the latter camp. His starting point was a train known as the 4-sub, or 4-car suburban unit. Bulleid took this and expanded it as far as he possibly could within the loading gauge. The end result was known as the 4DD. The 4DDs are often considered not to be true double-deckers because what you actually had was alternating compartments. The feet of the people on the upper deck were level with the heads of the people on the lower deck. With the minimal space available, certain features had to be sacrificed. The windows on the upper decks couldn't be opened. There was no footboard on the outside of the coach, nor were there handles to steady passengers getting on or off. The seat cushions were thinner than usual, although given that cushions were much thicker back then, it would be interesting to compare them with those on a modern train. Even with all the compromises to get them within the loading gauge, they couldn't operate across much of the Southern Railway network. And after all of that, they achieved only about 30% higher capacity than the 4-subs. Now, it should be pointed out that trains back then were laid out differently. Carriages were divided into compartments with individual doors rather than having an open plan with a couple of sets of doors per carriage. This meant that every lower deck compartment had to have a staircase to the corresponding upper deck compartment. That is a complicated arrangement. 2 4-coach units were put into service in 1949 after the Southern Railway had become the southern region of British Railways. They were set to work on the crowded Charing Cross to Dartford service, usually coupled together, and they immediately demonstrated why double-decker trains and commuter services don't mix. As expected, there was a longer dwell time at stations. They couldn't really be worked into the timetable because this was one double-decker train among a bunch of conventional trains. But there were also accidents, because there were no footboards or grab handles. And perhaps most interestingly, passengers often didn't use the upper deck compartments. They preferred to stand on the lower deck, even when seats were available upstairs. Remarkably, the DDs remained in service until 1971. 2 of their driving carriages survive today on a private site awaiting restoration. A 3rd carriage was saved, but it was scrapped when the railway centre where it was based was closed down. So you can't say that the concept wasn't tried. Could double-deckers ever work on British railways? Maybe, but I don't see it happening. Double-decker trains are best suited for long-distance routes with long periods between stops, and we don't have many of those in this country. Maybe Lumo or someone could do it if it weren't for the loading gauge thing. But on the whole, when it comes to 2-level trains, the deck's stacked against them. Well, I do hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, please do consider leaving a like and perhaps also subscribing for more. I would like as ever to thank my donors on Ko-fi and Patreon and here on YouTube for your ever-generous support. You are the pressure ventilation to my 4DD's upper deck. And I'll see you all again very soon. Cheerio.